Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cleaning Indie podcast, brought to you by American Facility Care. I'm your host, Tom Moore, co-founder of American Facility Care, and we like to talk about all things facility and building related. Are you a facilities director or property manager, or even the point person in charge of your building? If so, then this podcast is for you. On this episode, we're going to talk about how did the pandemic affect the cleaning industry? This is a question I get asked most often. Before we jump into that, though, I want to do a little housekeeping. On a note, I'd like to invite you to go to our podcast's webpage, which is cleaningindie.com. There you can click on the Cleaning Indie podcast, scroll to the bottom, and there you can send a message to me, a voice message. All you have to do is just click record. You can listen to it as many times as you want, re-record it, and just send it. And it'd be a good way to potentially get on the show where I can play your question or comment, and we can discuss that on the show. All right, well, let's get into today's episode. So how did the pandemic affect the cleaning industry? This is one topic where we don't want to go back and revisit or go into the past. Man, it's been 3.5 years. This is the fall of 2023. And so not too far away from being at the 4-year mark since the pandemic started. And so we're going to look back at some of what it was like in the early first stages of the pandemic. I remember going to an account and hearing about it either through some news I was reading on the way or something I was listening to on the radio on the way, and just hearing about how it was affecting our country. We had heard about it early on in 2020 across the globe. And when it came to America, it seemed like, and we could blame COVID brain or whatever for our facts and exact dates of it, but it seemed like it was March 2020 when, if you remember, the 15 days to flatten the curve kind of happened. And I remember being at one specific account. It was a church. And I remember just happening to discuss this with the pastor at the time of that church. And I think one of his staff members came up while we were talking and kind of talked in a lower tone and said, hey, this COVID thing, this is kind of real, and we might need to kind of figure out what we're going to do. They're talking about we're going to have to shut down. And I remember hearing that conversation between these two pastors and just how it sunk in. I remember seeing the face of this head pastor at the church and just seeing how that news, just seeing it sink into him and how an amazing thing that was for him to come to that reality of shutting the church down. I mean, that was something that had never had to have been considered in his lifetime, shutting the church services down for a time. And so just experiencing that was surreal for sure in the moment. Well, we want to discuss how it affected people in general. If you're like me and you've been to a restaurant and maybe you've gone to the restroom and you've seen maybe an employee leaving the restroom, and it's interesting to note how many times they do or don't wash their hands. If you're like me, you've seen several employees at different restaurants who just don't wash their hands on the way out, even though there's clearly signs on the mirror or the door on the way out. And the pandemic, I think, helped in that area in society in general, just not just workers at restaurants, but just general folks who, cleanliness was not next to godliness as we were taught growing up for them. And they struggled with, maybe personal hygiene in that way. Washing hands is really a basic concept. And so I think in general, it helped in that regard shed light on the importance of personal hygiene and not spreading germs. It put on the forefront of people's minds, touching doorknobs and light switches and how, germs spread through touching similar surfaces as another person touches who might be sick with not just COVID, but any type of virus or sickness. And so it really helped in that regard elevate personal hygienes. Well, another way that it affected us as a company, you might wonder, okay, so maybe you know how it affected your business and your line of work or your industry. And you might be curious, well, how did it affect the cleaning industry, specifically the professional commercial cleaning industry? I can't really speak to residential cleaners as that's not something that we do, but I can speak to the commercial cleaning industry, specifically a family-owned business, not a nationwide cleaning industry or business. business, but a local to central Indiana business. And so I can speak to that. And what it did is, I remember it took some time. We had several daycares and schools and churches that were really affected the most at the time, where we dropped services with them completely, or I should say, where they dropped services completely with us for a number of months. And so it was about half of our accounts at the time that we lost during that time of COVID in early 2020. And so, yeah, we definitely were affected by it negatively initially. Then I'll say this, it did end up giving us more business, unfortunately, in the way of, people getting COVID and spreading it in their workplaces, unfortunately. And so we were called upon, as countless other cleaning companies and cleaners in the industry were called upon to disinfect COVID. We were contracted through a major state university in our state. There would be dormitories where they would put people who tested positive for COVID. This is one university who developed tests within the university system. They developed their own tests, scientific COVID tests. And so they had all their students take those tests, and many of them were testing positive. And so there would be a couple buildings where they would put them before they were allowed to go home after their 2-week quarantine or go back to classes, whichever. We would come in and disinfect those apartment dormitory rooms where they were staying for 2 weeks with COVID. And so early on, we really kitted up. We masked up. We had not even the N95, but we had the kind of the painter's mask with the breather filters on there that filtered out all kinds of things. And then we wore the white suits, and from head to toe, even the footies on our feet and gloves and glasses, eyewear, we were completely kitted up and protected from COVID. We didn't know what it was going to do if we got it, or we certainly did not want to spread it to anyone else. And so we even disinfected our equipment after we did the COVID treatment. Now, we also took a course for COVID cleaning through GBAC, which is the Global Biorisk Advisory Council. And that is a globally recognized training and certification process that we actually went through some online training and got certified to actually do COVID cleaning. And so that actually helped us get that account at the time. And we did a bunch of COVID cleaning for churches all over central Indiana, for schools, daycares, all kinds of facilities, offices. And so we were one of the companies that were, I guess, blessed or lucky enough, however you want to look at it, to acquire an electrostatic cleaner. And if you're not familiar with the electrostatic cleaner, they were sold out pretty quickly and the value of them skyrocketed. The cleaner that we got at the time we got it for $1,800. Now you can get them very readily available. You can get them for less than $200, the same exact kind. It was a backpack cleaner with the electrostatic spray wand. And if you're not familiar with those, it puts a positive ionic charge onto the cleaning chemical molecule. And so before it leaves the end of the wand, it's giving an electrostatic charge, an electric charge. And so it's a positive charge, and most items in our world are negatively charged. And so the positive obviously attracts to the negative. And so it's a very fine micron down to, I think, 45 microns, maybe even less than that. And so then what it does is it kind of wraps around an item. And so if you spray it in this direction, it would wrap around this item and get both sides and all sides. So it would be full coverage. So you could really go through a whole facility and just literally disinfect the entire facility within a couple hours, depending on the size of it, or even less. So we also followed the CDC guidelines for disinfecting, and so they had a 2-step process. And so the first step was to physically clean the surface. And so you could use soap and water, you could use a disinfectant, but you needed to physically wipe down the surface with a microfiber cloth. So that was step 1. Step 2, following the CDC guidelines, is you would need to come in with either an electrostatic sprayer or just a spray bottle with a certified disinfectant, certified to work on COVID and kill COVID. And so we would do that. Now, those chemicals were also hard to find at the time. At the time, one of the things we're going to talk here quickly about the supply chain, but hospitals and anything to do with healthcare, they were buying up, and no fault for them for doing it. They needed it. probably the most. They were buying up all of the disinfectant chemicals. They were buying up all the PPE. And so what that did for the supply chain was it made it really difficult to find disinfectant that was approved, because the EPA and the CDC also had a list of approved cleaners to work against COVID. We found some that worked. And then when you bought some, you'd have to look at the dwell time, because that's very important. The more expensive the chemical, the quicker the dwell time, or the less dwell time it will have. So for instance, a really expensive disinfectant or quaternary or germicide product that works on COVID would have like 60 seconds or less. Even I've seen 30 seconds or even instant, almost like a few seconds. That's really expensive. It's hard to obtain. And so the hospitals were getting that chemical quickly and buying it all up. So for us, we had to get the chemical that the dwell time would be 5 to 10 minutes. And so you could find it. It was tough to find, but we did find some. And that's what we used in our electrostatic sprayers, as well as our spray bottles for general cleaning at that time. And so it was difficult to find the PPE and the disinfectants. So that was the two-step process for the CDC guidelines that we followed for COVID cleaning. Well, at one point, we had somebody reach out to us that had to follow FDA guidelines for their manufacturing process. And so they were required to have a certain number of disinfectant wipes, and they just could not find them. They had people whose sole job was to buy products, and so they just could not find those products anywhere. And we struggled to find them as well. So what we did is we were able to put together our own disinfectant wipes, and that was an interesting process of buying the right type of paper towel rolls that would not shred or dissolve in the cleaning chemical, and then find the right FDA approved or CDC approved cleaning agent to work against COVID. So we were able to combine those, and we made massive amounts of disinfectant wipes within a 5-gallon pail. And so they had a big roll of paper towels. I don't really remember how many sheets there were, well over 1,000 sheets, I believe, big full-size sheets that they would use to wipe their instruments down at their workplace to stay FDA compliant. So that's what we did for one of the people that reached out, one of the companies that reached out during that time. So I want to also look, that's the supply chain. I also want to look at how it changed how people view janitors, custodians, and cleaning companies in general. I really do think COVID elevated the cleaning industry in general. I know cleaners at hospitals and the environmental departments, they were elevated because they were coming in after hospital cases of COVID where people were on their deathbeds, and they were cleaning those deathbeds. They were cleaning the people that succumbed to COVID, unfortunately, or those who survived. And so those folks were really elevated, and in turn, it filtered down to your general janitor in any building that they cleaned, because they were, considered essential workers who would show up and clean known cases of COVID or potential cases of COVID. And so I think it really helped elevate the cleaning industry as a whole and put them in a positive light. People started viewing the cleaning company as more than just a trash and dash where they collect the trash out of your building and get out of there and go home. It was really more of an essential industry where there's a risk of obtaining this virus or other viruses. And so they're putting themselves on the line in that sense. And they're going in with the proper gear, the proper chemicals, and the proper training. And they're doing things that, sure, a lot of people can do, but they don't have the time or the training to do properly. And so that really helped elevate janitors on a whole. So businesses saw the true value of a good janitorial company and what they could provide. Also, a good company would stay up with the CDC protocols and the chemical list, because that was continually being updated with more approved chemicals and disinfectants that we could provide and apply them, even with the risk of getting COVID. All right, lastly, I want to ask, how did COVID affect your industry that you're in, or maybe even specifically the company that you're in? And so if you want to go to our website, cleaningindy.com, and you click on the link where you can send a message to me, or just find us on Google, Spotify, Apple, or YouTube and leave a comment. We'd love to chat with you and answer any comments or questions that you may have. And if you'd like to learn more about the process of disinfecting and how important it is, we do have a healthy blog with several articles on our website. Just visit us at cleaningindy.com. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.